Hello all and welcome back to another video. The time has finally come where we're going to start assembly of my Silvertag CT70. So for those following, we spent the last, I don't know, year maybe, collecting parts, having things painted, building engines, shipping parts from overseas, and we're now at a point where we have everything to put this bike together and finish it off. So in today's video, we're going to start assembly with the wheels and work our way through this bike. Hope you guys enjoy it, and let's get into it. Right guys, here we are, and I do hope that you're all as excited as me to get this thing finally built. So as mentioned, we've got a load of parts. Here's a box showing a little glimpse of what we've got. We've got brand new parts in all that Honda packaging. I've got shelves literally stacked full of parts. We've got painted parts here, forks, headlights and the works. So let's get straight into this and start building these wheels. Starting with the wheels, as it's a nice sub-assembly to do off the bike. You can see we've got pretty much new everything. The hubs are about the only original thing, and that's mainly because they take such a hammering. If you saw the strip down of this bike, the rims were glued to the tyres and you can get yourself some problems trying to save them. But here we are, and let's get it together. We are starting off on the rear wheel, and the first thing I'm doing is getting some of the smaller parts put together, starting with the rear sprocket, that plastic sort of separator spacer, and the cush drive rubbers. We put cush drive rubbers in as new because they do wear out, they get soft, and I want it to feel nice and tight. Following that, we've got the rear hub, and with a little bit of heat, we're just going to heat up that bearing surface so then we can knock these bearings in. I'm not doing it in the most clinical way. You can get presses, you can make tools, but for me, a nice fitting socket, a hammer and an extension does the job perfectly. And as you can see, I'm always checking to make sure these bearings are spinning nice and smooth after being installed. With that middle bearing spacer dropped in and the other bearing put into place, we can move on to the next part in this, which is going to be the sprocket side mounting and the seal. So with a little bit of grease, you can literally push these seals in by hand. No need for a tool, maybe use a tool to press it home, but actually, as you can see, it does sit down really well. From there, we can finally drop on that sprocket and those rubbers, and it's a really nice tight fit. As you can see, you really have to push this down to open up that groove for the circlip, but that just shows that it's fitting well and going together nice and tight. A new circlip gets dropped into place, and as you can see, with a little bit of persuasion, we get that to sit down and hold that sprocket tight into place. And then we move on to unpacking these rims. Now these rims are from TB parts. They did come from Shire bikes, but they're technically an overseas part. Like I say, did want to save the old ones, but the tyre was so welded to that rim, I was going to do more damage to the rim trying to get it off than I was actually buying some new ones. They look completely stock and they're already painted, so cost wise it's probably a cheaper way to do it. From here we start to look at dropping this hub into the rim, and it's a little bit fiddly. You've got a sort of locating nut on the back of the hub, and then we've got our fresh zinc plated hardware that's going through the other side. And as mentioned in other videos, this is a Silvertag, so we've got them big bolts with the number 8 on them. They've all been zinc plated and they look really good, so I was keen to keep them, and I think it's come out well. Moving swiftly onwards, we go to that rear brake drum, and we have got some new pads slash drum pads to go into this assembly. For the price, it's a no-brainer, and they're going inside a nicely polished cap. From there, we can kind of button up this rear wheel. You've got some zinc plated spacers and not a new axle, a like new axle. So the axles we had zinc plated, and part of that process made it hard to install them. So we had a few issues, but once we got around that, we were actually able to drop this axle in, drop that brake side on, and put a nut on it, so it was all sealed as one unit. And I have to say, that was very satisfying. So guys, that is the first sub-assembly complete. Actually a lot more work than you think. One of the things that did catch me out was my new zinc plated bolts. As much as it's nice having freshly plated bolts, it's actually added to the thickness, meaning that I could not pass the axle easily through my bearing. So I threw that on the lathe, ran it with a bit of sandpaper and just took that plating off, or knocked it down a little bit, and we're all together. But it looks awesome. We've got the freshly polished hubcap for the brakes. We've got new drums, obviously the rims are fresh tyres. We have got a 33 tooth sprocket because that gear has been recommended to me. We've got new rubbers, we've got a clean plastic, and yeah, the original bolts with the big 8 on them, kind of symbolising the silver tag. Yeah, so looks really good. I'm happy with that, and now it's time to move on to the front. So, as can be imagined, the front wheel isn't a million miles away from the rear. One of the big differences being that we now have a speedo drive on the front axle, as that tells you what speed you're doing and takes it from that front wheel. So with that, you do have a small gear drive mechanism that sits inside that front brake hub cap. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Pack it with grease, make sure it's clean, and make sure it spins freely before you put it together. But outside of that, it's pretty much the same as the rear, just taking our time, putting it together and making sure that everything is solid and tightened up before I go any further. On my last build, I made the mistake of leaving things loose on the assumption I tighten them up at the end, and that did mean that you get caught out with the occasional odd bolt. So we're eliminating that completely and making sure everything is tightened up before we go any further. With both wheels complete, I think we're going to bring the frame over now and start doing some early assembly on that. So wiring harness, ignition, get those early things in before we look at pairing the engine and the frame. So really happy with these. Let's get on to the next bit. We have started off framework by taking my tap and die set here and running through every single thread on the frame. So no matter how good your painter is, you're always going to get paint in threads and stuff like that, and trust me, it's way easier to spend the time at the start, clean all the threads out, and then when you assemble it's nice and easy. There's nothing worse than being halfway through a build and finding a bolt is jammed or tight or stuck. And the last thing you want to do, trust me, is cross-thread a bolt on a freshly painted frame. So half an hour to clean the threads, and this is obviously my first CT70, and I'm going to start with the innards. So I'm thinking we're going to get the harness in, the lock set and the coil. So let's get into that. Right, so straight into the frame, and we're starting with that lock set and harness. We've got a new harness. Old wires go brittle, connectors break, terminals break, and I don't want to be dealing with any of that. And at the same time, I didn't have a lock set with this bike when I bought it. It was taken off for some reason, so it's never had a key. So we've gone ahead, bought the Honda lock set and a reproduction harness. The lock sets aren't cheap, £100 for a 3-position ignition switch, but it will be nice, and it's high quality and it's Honda. It's something you touch and I can justify spending the money there. So we passed that lock through and managed to feed it just through that hole in the front and get that lock ring in place. With that lock now in place, I just want to take the harness and have a quick tidy up, push those wires where they're going to sit in the bike, and it just helps plan out for connecting things so I'm not guessing where each wire goes. And following that, we've got the grommet which pops into place. A little bit fiddly, but it fits really well, and you can see why they've added that to this bike. At this point inside the frame, it's hard to capture all of the little details, but we have just fitted the rubbers which support the tank, and now we're dropping in the coil. And one of the most important things to do with this coil is grind off a bit of paint where your coil bolts, because obviously you want the coil to be grounded to the chassis. So a bit of sandpaper to that, no problem, and you're not worried as it won't be seen. At this point, I was pretty happy to go ahead and put the engine back onto the stand where I built it and get ready to mount this frame to the engine. I don't want to go too far with the frame, as I've got to be able to lift it, I've got to be able to move it, and it's much easier working at bench height like I have this stand for. So we get the engine bolted in, and I can actually come over and drop that frame straight on top, which makes this whole thing loads easier. 2 bolts slide in, and we're not worried about tightening these up crazy, as I'm sure it will come back off for something small. And a little off topic, but we're going back to the engine to add some of these final touches that we may as well do whilst the engine's on the stand and the frame's on it now. So we've got a Katako 14 tooth sprocket, and that goes on and we're also going to add some small bits like the rubber for the gear shifter. Just gives it that really nice finishing touch. When you buy one of these bikes, they're always knackered because it's probably had 50 years of being shifted up and down. So we slide that on and we move to the icing on the cake, which is a new side magneto cover. For those who know your bikes, the original 69 came with one of these side covers with a hole in it. My bike did not come with that, so we've imported this from Canada. A really nice replica which allows us to make the engine look as OEM as possible. So guys, I think we are going to wrap up today's video right there. So we have got the frame onto the engine, we've dressed the last bit of the engine with the final magneto cover, the side Honda cover here, and a few pieces of rubber, and I'm very happy. So let's end this episode there, and my plan is to really smash on with this build and put out a few episodes that may be a bit shorter but should be more frequent. So hope you've all enjoyed it. Please do subscribe if you want to see this build come to life. We have all the parts now, so it is happening, and hopefully before we know it, we'll be out on the road enjoying it. Until next time, take it easy, and I'll see you then.